Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what part of the world you are in. We tend to get people from all over. Um, Rana and I are both from Digitsole, so I'm the director of education, and I am also a practicing clinician and have a history in clinical application and sports science. So this is our monthly recurring webinar. So this is specific to our product. So it's not meant to be a sales pitch or anything like that. So we invite people that currently have the product. So we focus on improving utilization, but certainly we do get people that may not have the product, and you are more than welcome. We get all kinds of different people, including salespeople and whatnot, just interested in the technology and maybe how to better discuss it. So know that I don't go through, how to take the data collection. So I don't go through the process of putting in the inserts or things like that. So the focus really is on the interface and the user experience that you see. I use the online, so the app that you find on the web. Um, you collect the information with a mobile device, as most of you know that actually have the product. And you can see a lot of this information on the mobile device. I tend to collect it on the mobile device. I may quickly show something to a patient, but then we move into another room and I have my discussion with people utilizing the computer app, just because it has more information and there's some things on there that you can do, which I will show you here in a moment. So today's discussion is based on the performance rehab module. So that is developed after a specific group of field tests: the counter movement vertical jump, the single leg horizontal or forward hop, the single leg horizontal or forward triple hop, and then the 30-second side hop. And of course, those individual leg tests we perform with both the right and the left, so that way we can do that comparison. So it utilizes tests that were developed really for the field, that didn't have a lot of equipment, including motion analysis, and so just a tape measure and a stopwatch in the case of the 30-second, or a Vertec or something that you can measure vertical displacement. And so what we've been able to do is certainly capture the essence of what those particular tests are intended to capture, which is usually a distance or a height, or numerical value in the number of jumps. But we've integrated those tests with our technology so we can capture a lot more characteristics, which include some things that I will show you here momentarily, that a lot of people actually aren't even familiar with. And part of that reason is, even with typical motion analysis, it's actually difficult to capture some of the metrics and biomarkers that we're able to capture with our particular device. With that being said, that's why some of this can be a little bit challenging to decipher this information. But there's some really good data out there. There are papers showing that the actual characteristics that we find from a biomechanical standpoint, not just the outcomes measures, but the characteristics associated with the kinematics and the kinetics of the orientation of the human body as it results in ground contact or takeoff, depending on which aspect you're actually looking at. A lot of what we tend to look at is ground contact, because the activities associated with why we even evaluate this is often looking at potential prediction of future injury or recovery from injury, to make sure that we get back to appropriate level of return to play. So a lot of those are based on those landing characteristics. We also have some interesting data now, because we have this technology with the ability to further evaluate those specific movement patterns. So those tests that we utilize in the performance rehab module were based on return to play criteria, especially following injury or surgical procedures. And one of the more popular ones is ACL. anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction. So when an athlete is coming back, often people will use these tests and they'll do a comparison between the performance. And that performance, for example, in the single leg triple hop is that single hop distance in or the triple hop distance. In the single leg hop, it's the single distance. And in the side hop, it's the number that a person can accumulate within that 30 seconds, which we'll look at here in just a moment. So what we've been able to do is actually provide a lot more detailed information and characteristics associated with that. So I decided to use a young person for this process. And the reason for that is you will really be able to see and identify these differences because they're much more characteristic visually, because I did use the video as well. And first we'll look at a little matrix action here, and then I will go to this home screen here. So I did use the video as well, and I'm going to make some comments about video and videography in general, and I'll show you another tool that I also use, because we're able to take video with our system, and then I can download it and export it and open it up into something that has a little bit more detail to it, and the ability to look at a little bit more information from that perspective, which I'll show you here in a moment. So this is the dashboard. So when you sign in or log in to your dashboard, it just pulls up some of your basic information, and there's a workspace up here. So those of you that may or may not know, this actually allows me to share this workspace. So either with the same login, so people having the same system, you have two unique logins that come with the product, but I can actually share my workspace. So if you have another colleague someplace else who has their own license and system, you can share your workspace and coordinate and look at some of the details with regards to the data. Even if you don't do that or can't do that, you can actually export this information that you've collected and send that off in a PDF file. So pretty simple. So this is the home screen. You can click on patients. It'll show you patients. If you click on your equipment, it'll show you what you have available to you, such as the pods. So this particular license, I only have one set of pods or sensors. Those are the sensors that can be connected. So I have multiple sensors. I don't have them on this particular license. So what I can do for this purpose, and actually part of this topic is related to what's called baseline testing. So this is similar to just getting performance characteristics of whatever test, before someone's injured, before they start training, before a season, something like that. So it literally is your baseline test. So that way, you know what has either gotten better or worse as a result of training, or as an injury, or through growth and development. Also in your settings, you know that you can change this. Obviously, I have mine set to English, and because I'm American and show the Americans Imperial, even though we publish our data in the metric system, we consistently use the Imperial system. So I've kind of left it at that because we've got both people here. So I'm going to go back to the patients, and I'm going to choose this patient. And this particular person, let me find them here. Scroll down, and here he is. So he is a 9-year-old, and we consider him an elite athlete. He's involved in multiple sports, so he's a multiple sport athlete. And the reason we may call him an elite athlete is because he tends to play at the higher levels. So he gets accepted to the higher level teams. And incidentally, he's also my son. So that's another why I think he's a high level athlete, because I want him, to get a scholarship and make it easier to pay for college. But I also coach him. So he's right now he's in baseball season. So he has one of the highest batting averages. He has really good pitching credentials. Last night he just tested. He had the fastest It's slightly less than 20 meters. It's about 20 yards to first base at 3.5 seconds. So he had the fastest run in his age group. So he actually does have a lot of really good characteristics, other than just my opinion as his dad, and as my wife always says, our children are not your experiments, but isn't life an experiment? Um, so what happens is when you click on your patient, it will show you a dashboard of the most recent analyses. And if you need to look at more, you just click on practitioner analysis and it will populate a larger list of the analyses. If you click on patient file, it pulls up the patient's characteristics, and you can change those. So, this is embedded inside of a clinical system. So that's why it says, what is the condition, reasons for consultation, and patient background. He doesn't actually have a problem. So this was just baseline testing for my purposes of evolution and following. And I think you'll see maybe some interesting things. But like I said, it's to really kind of show um, the evident things that you can just simply see on video, and hopefully be able to match those things up. So let's go back to the dashboard, and let's start with the counter movement vertical jump. So the counter movement vertical jump is one of the most well known and well utilized tests for performance. It has correlations to things like one repetition maximum and squat, to sprint speed, and it's a really good test, especially for force and power characteristics, especially power. So we can actually perform a vertical jump and measure the time in flight, and actually create a power calculation from that using a specific algorithm. So counter movement has been around for a really long time, and is a really good test for overall performance. Now, it's a double leg test, although there is a single leg counter movement vertical jump. We only have the double leg counter movement vertical jump, but we do get this individual leg characteristics. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video. I'm going to put it up to full screen. Right? So that's him. Very little cueing, other than I told him what the test was going to be like. And so, I'm gonna show this in slow motion here in a moment, but you can probably already pick up, certain characteristics of things that we could change. If you've ever worked with youth athletes, you'll notice that there's a lot of variability in performance, and we don't over teach a lot of technique, at least at the beginning, because oftentimes, if there does seem to be some abnormalities, they tend to grow out of it, such as the evolution of foot progression angle, for example. We don't intervene a whole lot. Most kids will grow out of a toe in position by the time they're, say, 9 years old. So we tend, to sort of allow a certain level of evolution. Now, I will say that in working with, and I do dedicate a lot of my time to working with youth athletes, that I do a lot of basic, corrections, and so we'll be working with him on this vertical jump. Because let me play that again, and if watch quickly, you could see when he was getting into his ready position, he's got a little bit of dynamic knee valgus. Now, this is a little bit difficult to establish with one camera view, and I'm going to show you a little something here in a moment. But I think it's slightly obvious, and there has been some data showing, because there are some devices that simply use a mobile device to capture this information, and there is correlation to measuring dynamic knee valgus with a single camera. I will say get good at your technique. There are better ways to do this. And so, for example, you'll notice that I'm shooting straight on, but it looks like, we're looking uphill. And that's part of the distortion that happens as a result of your camera position, but also the distortion that we naturally see in those devices. The way that those cameras are designed is not, a straight shoot like a normal camera. There's also certain limitations in the frame rate, or the speed, the number of frames, right? So most cameras will shoot at a frame rate of about 30 frames per second, and that seems like a lot, and it's more than enough for basic collection of video. But when we think of things that take, a fraction of a second and even smaller than when we're looking at, peak force development and things like that, that actually take place over a really short period of time, you might want something a little bit faster if you wanted to get into that. So that's where the video is going to populate with your system. Now, if you click on these three dots, you can see it says to download. You can change the playback speed. So I had it set at normal. So let's set it at half speed and see what that looks like. And sometimes that can be a little bit better if you're showing someone or you're trying to evaluate. Okay, it slows it down to half speed, which is about 15 frames per second. And you can stop and start at different points and look at, maybe right before takeoff or right before landing. Again, so you can see, some of the characteristics of his knee joint position. If you wanted to evaluate timing, we know that, there's a timing effect in terms of shoulder elevation, forward arm motion with regards to him maximizing his capability of performing this vertical jump. Now, there's really two ways you can do this. You can do this with the arm sweep, or you do this with hands on hips. The way that we develop our algorithm is it's hands on hips, but you're perfectly fine doing it with the arm sweep. But you need to make sure that you're very consistent. And by consistent is you choose, are you going to be doing this with the arm sweep or not? I like to use an arm sweep because I want to look at the full technique. If someone really wanted to look at mostly the lower extremity, then they're going to use the hands on hip. We found that, in a lot of the research that I've been involved with, a lot of athletes are used to using that. So it may play to that. Then there's athletes that are not. So if they're not used to jumping, that may not be something that's consistent with how they actually move. So that'll be up to you to decide how you'd like to do that. We scroll down a little bit and now we can see just sort of this graphical representation of what this is. And let me start up here. Um, these three dots, I can rename the analysis. I can do the comparison, export the PDF, or delete the analysis. Now, in your systems, on the mobile device, you'll have a few different options, and so because the video is not a requirement, so you can decide whether or not to use it. So, for example, I don't typically use it in the 30-second unless I'm inside and I have a really good strong Wi-Fi connection because it is a little bit data heavy, and that's kind of important. And you don't want to have an error and then miss out on the entire test. Obviously, this test only takes a very, very short period of time. The flight time is 400 milliseconds, so it's even less than uh, a half a second. And so the tests don't take very long. It's more so the setup. So having a strong Wi-Fi signal, having yourself all ready, and the sensors being put in there appropriately certainly reduce that time. So it does give you the individual characteristics of, right, this is the left leg and this is the right leg. Why is that? Well, because we have a sensor in each foot, and then there's an aggregate, and the way that the algorithm works is very similar. We use a very similar algorithm that we use with force platforms. A lot of people questions like, well, how can you get jump height, without actually measuring the height? Well, we're measuring displacement, and we know the effects due to gravity, and it's, as we say, it's just simple physics. Which for some people it's not simple at all. But so that is a very well known and validated algorithm that we can actually measure center of mass displacement with the sensors with the timing effect. Now, because we have sensors in the foot and not just using a force platform, we're actually getting a lot of the similar characteristics that we're able to capture in some of these others. Now, I'm going to take a quick moment here because what I personally do, if I'm not working with large groups, I like to take either a run or a walk. I at least always take a walk. And so let me show you real quickly, a couple of things here. So this is him walking, and actually this is a year earlier. And so we can see, some of his characteristics on his trajectory, fairly normal here on this left. It's a little bit on the inside, but this is actually normal, for an 8-year old, um, as they're developing their medial arch. And this is a little bit different that we see here on the left. And, that's piqued my interest, and not for any other reason because I'm also a clinician. Most people will never see this kind of data, but now I at least have some sense of, okay, what exactly does that mean? The other thing I want you to kind of look at here too is his foot progression angle. He's within the norm, right? So the two standard deviations is really about -2 to approximately 14 degrees of external rotation. So negative meaning a slightly in towing. He doesn't have in towing. He's fairly neutral, but he has a what's called a normal, out towing. But there's a big, a large difference, between the two. So I look at those things and take those things into consideration, not because there's anything wrong, but now having this opportunity, that otherwise a lot of people don't, collecting baseline data on as many people as I can is pretty cool, pretty awesome in my opinion. Um, Again, if you're working with large groups, it can certainly be a little bit challenging. But if you're in a clinic setting, or you have an opportunity to cycle through, some of these groups. So when I measure a whole team, I mean, it does take me more like 35 minutes to 45 minutes if I'm moving through them relatively quickly to be able to capture all of this data. But with a young person who's progressing, there's a lot of variability. We all know that in terms of the in terms of gait variability. There's even more variability in terms of this. So let's go back and look at what we have here. So the general or standard dashboard shows you three characteristics. Let me also say that in all of our jumps, they're the same metrics. So you don't have to relearn it all, but just know that if you're jumping horizontal versus vertical, you should have some different expectations. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, the most basic concept to consider when you're looking at data, especially in a young person where there's more variation, are they at peak height velocity, growth velocity? Have they bypassed that? Are they before, the peak height? Those are things that actually matter. So, for example, when we want to say that, there's normative characteristics with regards to a certain movement pattern, passing that, peak height, um, vertical height velocity growth is, relatively important because there's a lot of changes that are going on right now. And as you can imagine, this kid is growing like daily based on the shoes and the clothing that we have to purchase. So flexion angle at takeoff. So this is the foot relative to the surface of the ground, right? And so if you know about, vertical jumping, you know that, one of the last things you'll do before you take off from the ground is maximizing plantar flexion. Now, I like to see definitely in the 40s. He's in the 30s here, and he's got a 5-degree difference between the two. Is it pathological? No. Like I said, this is a baseline data test, and I'm going to do a comparison. I'm going to show you a couple things here in a moment. Now, the takeoff velocity, this can actually help explain some of those differences that we might see. You'll notice that he's got a 238 degree per second. So, in other words, that's how fast in angular velocity his foot is moving between the right and the left, right? From that toe position until he releases from the ground. And I'm going to come back to that because I just want to get through this. And then contact stability. So, contact stability. So, this is something that's, well, it's quite new to a lot of people. And what this means is within the first 250 milliseconds, right? So that's 1/4 of a second, 0.25 seconds upon landing, we are measuring the amount of deviation and which direction it's going in. And we are measuring how quickly that's happening. So, in general, what we like to see here is single number characteristics and relatively higher numbers here. If I see greater than 50 degrees per second, especially if it's a large number, then that's actually a good thing. So what do I mean by this? So here's what happens is when you land, right, you want to be as stable as possible. Now think about this for a second because this is just a counter movement vertical jump. In fact, one of the cues we're explaining to people when we're doing this test is upon landing, I want you to be as stationary as possible so we can upload the data, right? So it's a really cool test because think about sport, for example, and when you land and then you need to change direction, there's not a lot of time in between those two events. And so you need to be as stable as possible. And some people have seen me show the gentleman in the side hop and turning his ankle over while he's on his way up, right? Because that time frame in between change of direction, whether it's vertical or horizontal, and then any direction, horizontal, is relatively short. So you would want someone to be able to land and become as stable as possible. In other words, they shouldn't have a lot of extra correction within that time frame. And in fact, you would want them to correct that relatively quickly. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So I click on advanced and we get a few more characteristics. Rotation around z-axis. I really like this, and in both the vertical and the horizontals. And here's the reason why. Think about foot progression angle. And let me pull up this again real quick. Right? So you all know about foot progression angle, and that's the amount of toeing out. So during walking, as you can imagine, we do have some normative values, as I mentioned. Two standard deviations of foot progression angle is approximately -2 to 14 degrees in asymptomatic populations, right? And so what we look at in terms of this is how it also relates to things like trajectory in this pronation and supination, right? And so what's more important when we're looking at things like high force, high power movement patterns, as we see here in this jumping, is that degree of rotation influences the moment of force, the amount of force that's now being projected at the knee joint. And that's kind of an important thing, right? So let's take one of the reasons that we have this test, which is the anterior cruciate ligament injury. And we find that, especially in a younger age population, they are predominantly non contact, meaning that someone didn't come and hit them. It was either on landing, change in direction, or deceleration, right? So let's say they're slowing down, running very linear, and then they want to stop and they want to turn to the left, right? Maybe they're running down the field in American football and they need to catch a pass, or in soccer or football in the rest of the world, they need to cut and make a change in direction. Those angles are very, very important because of the amount of stress. Because at certain points, remember, during that change in direction, the facilitation and stability of those articulations when you're transitioning from eccentric back to concentric muscle contraction, there's a moment in time where there's not a lot of muscle stability going on. And that's why joint mechanics are very, very important. So what do we have here? Rotation around this z-axis is basically the same thing as the foot progression angle. So this is on landing, right? And this is on initial landing when the leg is actually in a relatively straight position. As you can imagine, it's not going to move a whole lot. But if you see dynamic knee valgus continue when they're absorbing into that landing position and they have a very excessive rotation around that z axis, a high positive angle, right? That's actually a lot of moment of stress around that knee joint in dynamic knee valgus. And that's what's unique about it. Doesn't even have to be necessarily seen at the knee valgus position, but because of that foot orientation and its association with the moment of stress at the knee relative to that position, because that roll in, remember, as we start to flex that knee, we do have um, rotation right at that tibial femoral joint, so it can give way a little easier than when it's in that straight position. So when I look at this rotation around the z-axis, right, I don't want to go past single digits in the negative, and I don't want to go past the 30 degrees in the positive. In fact, I don't like to see the 30 degrees in the positive either, and really want to see less than 25 degrees. And I'm going to show you something here in a second. This is just a vertical jump, so this is just up and down, right? Which is obviously seen in if you're going to be heading a ball, if you're going to be catching a pass, if you're playing basketball. There's a lot of vertical where you land and then need to turn around, change direction, run, whatever the case may be. And then, of course, there's the horizontal. And that's why I gravitate. I used to do a lot of vertical jumps, but we're seeing a lot more data showing the benefit of being able to assess these horizontal jumps, because they more so mimic things like deceleration and what happens right before someone changes direction, right? Because you need to be stable before you change that direction. Okay. Max acceleration at landing, similar to vertical loading rate, whether you're running or walking, or um, not exactly strike force, because this is measured in G's. So this is an acceleration at landing. Why G's and not actual force? Well, the reason is because in the world of biomechanics and physics, we don't have an algorithm to be able to base this off of. So we're using gravitational units, right? And so here's what I'm looking at. Now, if I'm training someone and I see that they have very poor technique, my expectation is when we're training and working with them, we should see a reduction in this number, right? And this is really also associated with, how quickly they absorb into that. So hip flexion and knee flexion, really important at landing for a vertical jump, but also deceleration in horizontal running or jumping as well. So we see here that at that left, he's got a 3.7, and here on the right, he's got 5. So we're looking at slightly over a 20% difference between the right and the left. So let's see if we can kind of match some of these things up here in a moment after we talk about this. The flexion angle at landing. That's the complete opposite of the flexion angle at takeoff. This is why I start with the counter movement vertical jump, because um, it's, what goes up must come down. So there should be very similar characteristics. And I want to see greater than 25 degrees. That means that I have good absorption at the ankle, right? So good plantar flexion means I'm going to be able to take that very, very strong and highly advantageous class 2 lever, right, at the ankle joint, and be able to absorb that energy. And it's not just my opinion. There's data that shows that that's a very important aspect at absorbing landing energy. And we see that there's this difference between the two. So let's look at that for a second. And we see that, he's at least at the ankle. He's not in the best position. He's landing a little bit more flat footed. And look at this. We actually see he's got a higher acceleration rate at landing. I'm not saying all of this is related to just the ankle. It's also the knee and the hip. And we'll go back to looking at the video here in a moment as well. The pronosupination at landing. This is similar to what we saw in the trajectory during ground contact time, right? The pronosupination angles during walking. So upon landing, now remember, when you're taking off in a vertical jump, you take off from your toes and you land from your toes, right? That's the benefit of landing like that. When we do horizontal, it's a little bit different. So if you've ever worked with like long jumpers, you'll notice that they'll heel strike into that landing position. So it's a little bit different. Now they're landing in soft dirt, which is a little bit different than landing on something really, really hard. So we don't necessarily heel strike. We're actually looking for a relatively neutral position, sort of similar to what a lot of pitchers you might see on the mound when they're throwing and moving out of that stretch and going into that forward momentum position. So we see the negative position is more so on heel inversion or supination, as we call it, and then -1 here. This is why I look at running and jumping characteristics, because I want to see if this matches up a little bit. So he's definitely within that normal position. If I start to see greater than 20 or 25 degrees, it means that they've got a lot of heel inversion, And that may put them at danger for a plantar flexed inversion ankle sprain, right? So that's definitely something to take into consideration. But this is very, very normal. And again, what's interesting is you look at the negative 12 degrees here and the 28 degrees. So he's in a really, really good position on that left. On his right, he's a little bit more flat footed. And that's why we see that he's only at -1 because he's almost landing in a relatively neutral position, at least in those shoes, right? So we already looked at this, but let's look at these two things together. And upon landing pronation supination angle, so he transitioned by 7 degrees. So he went from -12 to -5. And on this foot, however, he went from -1 to -9. Okay. So the positive negative value tells us which direction they actually went in, right? And so we see that he did move very, very fast. He translated by 8, increased by 8 degrees. But again, even at landing, that's -9 degrees, and that's actually not a bad position. And also remember that's not his final position. So let's go back. I'm gonna show you a comparison here, and I can compare two of these. I asked him to do it again. And the reason is because I don't think he gave it his all. And that's important when, you're looking for really good performance data, appropriate cueing, explanation of your expectations, explanation of what it is that you're looking for. So this top one, the 347, right? So his jump height was 7.6 inches. And on this jump height was 8.4. So, um, he increased by what, 12, 13%, just by improving the cueing and telling him, listen, I want you to jump as high as you can, go down as fast as you can, and come up as fast as you can. So we notice, he was in the air 14 milliseconds higher on this side, 21, 24 milliseconds on that side. He's a right foot control, but he's left foot dominant in terms of his power and his force production, right? Which is interesting. In our lab, we did a lot of like single leg work and evaluating symmetries and asymmetries, and we found that to be pretty consistent. In other words, if they weren't a professional athlete, that we found that people that had that dominant, in other words, if we asked them to kick a ball, which leg would you choose? And if they chose their right leg, we called that their dominant leg in terms of choice of activity. So what we found was the opposite leg typically had more strength and power, but had less control. Right. So looking at some of these characteristics was kind of interesting. Well, here's what we notice. We already see some potential differences as we look at the flexion angle on takeoff. So he was at 37 degrees and 42. Here he's at 44 and 30. So he reduced that or excuse me, slightly less delta here. So one of the things that also happens when you increase a stress load is it can help to tease out, some of those potential differences and problems. But also, what's interesting is he had a lower takeoff velocity with his feet. And one would say, well, that's not good, is it? It's not necessarily bad, right? Not everything, is higher or lower, but think about what happened. How was he able to jump higher if he actually had a lower takeoff velocity, right? On both of these feet. Well, remember that the vertical jump doesn't only utilize your plantar flexors, they also utilize your knee extensors and your hip extensors. So having better position, having better technique allowed him to then transition to where a lot of that force needs to actually go. So then we see in the contact stability 8 and 5. So it's actually much closer to a normal position or at least similar bilaterally. If we click in this here, we also notice a rotation around that Z axis. He's very symmetrical, but now he's landing with a little bit more of that toe in position between the two. We also see that he's improved his flexion angle because remember, up here on that first jump, he was at 28 degrees and 17 degrees, right? And his acceleration at landing was 3.7 and 5.0. And then we go down here, he actually has higher flexion angle at landing on both, but he's also very, very close to being the same, and he's almost identical in his acceleration rate at landing. Okay, he's a little bit closer in also being more symmetrical here. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. I'm going to put these two jumps side by side. And so what I did here was I matched them at peak height, right? But you'll notice that, some of the different takeoff characteristics. So over here on this left, so that was the lower jump. And I'll run this in slow-mo. And then the one on the right is actually a higher jump. So he sits back a little bit further. He gets a little bit more triple extension, hips and the knees, and he's a little bit more symmetrical on this right side. So here's what I was referring to is sort of being careful in the angle at which you shoot. Don't overdo it and looking at these videos and thinking that they're perfect, right? Because I mean, that's why in a lab, we measure, we make sure the orientation, the levelness of the cameras and things like that. All right, so let's go back to here. So that's the counter movement. These other ones will be easier. We'll be able to move through them a little bit faster just because we've already explained most of those characteristics. So I want to go to the single hop. And the single hop, like this is a great way to look at sort of maximal ability between the right and the left. So here's the way that the test is conducted is you need to be able to land and not do a double hop. Otherwise, it's considered to be an invalid test. So it's interesting because we're kind of putting in there that motor control aspect. Okay. So again, it populates both videos and we can run them at the same time if we want, right? So we start with the right leg or the left leg. You get to choose when you're running the test. Um, I tend to choose whatever foot they say that they would normally kick a ball with. But I want you to watch this real close. So this is the right, and actually I'm gonna change the playback speed to a 0.5% so you can actually see this. But just make note, what does it look like when he's landing? So this is his right foot. So he sticks that pretty good. Now let's look at his left. And let's reduce that to half speed as well. Whoop, 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 whoop. A little bit more wobbly. And in fact, he never completely gets his foot all the way down on the ground. Now, it still counts because he did land and he didn't have to put his other foot down within the first second. But what happened was, during that first 250 milliseconds that we look at contact stability, it's all messed up. Okay. But let's look at the performance characteristics. Well, on that left, he jumped further, right? He's got a 6% asymmetry between the right and the left, which is a good jump, good characteristic, because we're looking for no less than 10%. If it's greater than 10%, you need to further evaluate. And formally, people would just say greater than 10%. Well, then I'm not going to let them go back to play, right? But that not all was the best thing. Even when they have less than 10%, we now know that that's not enough data to say that I'm confident necessarily in returning to play. And in fact, we've got data that shows that you can actually still land pretty well and just not have good motor control, right? And that's why we start to look at some of these other tests. So we'll look at the triple hop in just a second here. So he's about 2.5 inch difference between the right and the left. And as you can imagine, his flight characteristics are going to be longer on the left because he jumped further on the left, right? But what's interesting is sometimes, and I've shown this previously, where I've had a 16% asymmetry in the distance that someone covered, but their flight times were the same. And the reason was because the height, the trajectory pattern that they followed when they were jumping, they jumped a lot higher on that one leg. So it wasn't that, he really had a deficit in terms of his overall flight time ability. It's just it was a control thing. It was a technique thing, and it wasn't really related to something that I would have kept him out of play for. But we see that he does have a longer flight time by 38 milliseconds on that left leg, and that's why he jumped a little bit further. But is it also a characteristic of his technique? So he did have a better peak height on that left side. Obviously, if you go too high, you're going to lose some of that horizontal capability. So flexion angle at takeoff, right? If you remember the counter movement vertical jump, remember I said, we like to see a certain number and that it's going to be different. Well, this is dramatically different. Why? Because he's now jumping forward. So his foot is not going to leave the ground until much later than when he's doing a vertical jump, right? And this looks really good. He's got good flight takeoff between the two. So then you would say, well, geez, why isn't he jumping as far? Well, it's really because it comes back to this partially, right? So his takeoff velocity between the right and the left, he's moving much faster on that left, which would translate into potentially greater rate of force development. Again, it's not just the ankle. You also need to look at the knee and the hip in terms of that ability to get there. Okay, pronosupination angle at landing, much more externally rotated on that. Internally rotated. That's what the negative means. Internally rotated on that left. I think you kind of saw that up here. Let me pull that up so we can look at that one more time. I'll try and pause it. And I've got this little app thing sharing, but it's really hard to see. So a good camera view to take for this one is also on the front. And in fact, it's probably a better camera view because now you're going to look at those frontal plane characteristics that typically are more associated with, some control issues and weakness. But you would see that he's dramatically towing in on that landing, right? And very different between the right and the left. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very characteristic of people, to do a little bit better in terms of an outcome performance on the non-dominant, right? So why is that? Well, we're hyper focused on getting really good. He plays football or soccer um, on in the fall, so he tends to kick with his right foot. He's very right foot dominant, so that also makes your left, sometimes a lot more stable because you need good stability, to have a really good kick. His contact stability, we see, he transitioned a positive 20 degrees. So he went from negative 31 to negative 11. So he was still in that heel inversion position and he just never completely got to it. That's why this is actually missing. Let's look at the advanced rotation around that Z axis. Lots of internal here on that right foot, on that left foot, basically neutral, right? And let's look at the landing characteristics as a result of that. Even though he jumped further and higher on his left foot, he had lower acceleration at landing, right? And that actually has to do with his how he was landing. You can't really see it on video that goes this slow, but he landed with a much more neutral foot versus on that right foot. That negative 17 degrees means that he's basically heel striking. So let's pull that and show that again. Trying to move that a little bit so we can see. We may not get to see it with this camera view, but basically that's what I'm. Oh, so you can see it right there. So he's basically heel striking, which again is not, very typical if you're a broad jumper or long jumper, if you're landing in a sand pit. But I don't want really someone heel striking like that when they're typically slowing down and decelerating, right? So that's why his acceleration rate at landing is not quite double, but it's about 40% greater than it is on the left. Okay. Let's look at the triple. So the triple hop, this is one of my favorites. And here's why. It's a repeated hop. So when you're telling the person to perform this particular skill, you want them to jump as fast and as far as possible on each one of their hops and then stick that last landing, right? The other characteristic that I really like from this is we get ground contact time. Okay. Let's look at this video real quick and let me change the speed here. So, does anyone want to take any guesses as to which one has a greater distance? All right, let's see. He jumped out of the frame there. Little extra hop. And then let's look at this one real quick. Playback speed at 5. Right? You can actually see the delay, between each jump. Okay. So let's see if you were right. Total distance on the left, 155 inches. Total distance on the right, 27 inches. Right, so almost by 27 inches on between the right and the left. So that's an asymmetry. Now, if this was a return to play athlete, and we saw this, we're like, that can't be that good. And so, um, is it that, he isn't rehabbed or no, it's very much technique, which is why, baseline and benchmark testing is good. It doesn't mean I'm going to leave this alone, right? Because for right now, why would I train him? Well, I want to train him to improve in his performance, but also reduce his potential risk of injury. So neither one of these are characteristic of injury per se, but he can run faster, right? So what we found in our lab and our research is, you're limited to the weakest link, the weakest leg. So look at this: his stance time, 398 milliseconds. That's your ground contact time, and he's 3/4 of a second ground contact time. That's not very good, right? So he's working a lot to transition, and he's losing a lot of that elastic nature when he's going from there. But he's got potentially better control. His swing time, because he's not jumping as far, is obviously going to be less, but the ratios, dramatically different, right? So his distances aren't the best. And this is where we get to see a comparison between the right and the left, and it tells us, where the advantage is. So by 15 inches on that last one, and that really skews it. So take that into consideration and why you might want to do what we find in research is we do three trials because 80% of people will typically perform the best on the second trial. Another 15% will perform best on the third trial. 5% will tend to do best on that first trial, right? So that's where if you're looking for peak values, you're typically going to choose the second, or you average the last two to get your standards. So what I like about this is it gives me the average. So look at this, right? 85 degrees versus 63 degrees. As you saw with his single leg at over 70 degrees, he's just not capitalizing on that takeoff angle. Same thing in that propulsion velocity. His pronosupination angles at landing, I'm okay with both of those. They're not bad at all. Same thing here with his contact stability. Yeah, he's at 10 degrees. I expect that to be a little bit higher in the triple jump because we're adding two, right? It's a really good stress load. And then in the advanced, it actually breaks it down and gives me the individuals. So what I like about this is I can see the evolution of the 3 jumps. And my favorite evolution of the 3 jumps to look at is this, the rotation around that Z axis. Okay. So, he really lands hard on that first one and toes in quite a bit, but he picks it up and he does better. It's when I see a progressive angle increase or decrease throughout the 3 jumps, because then you wonder, what is that fourth one going to be like, and how problematic is that going to be, right? So these are his landing characteristics, right? And based on what you know about physics, right, he should have a higher acceleration rate at landing, but he doesn't. Why? Because he's got better landing capabilities on the left than he does on the right, just evident right here, right? So he's landing with a better neutral foot, with his flexion angle at landing. His contact stability, all his numbers actually look pretty good. So nothing wrong with that. And he's got really high numbers when he's got a higher number here. It's only 3 degrees here with his change in position, but he only has to move 1 degree. So again, that's really not going to be an issue. I did not do a 30-second side hop on this young man. And the reason is because it's 40 centimeters. And what you're going to find is that's not good for young athletes. It's too far for them to side hop. Um, there is a validated 30 centimeter, and I'm pushing to see if we can get that changed, because it will allow me to do it. Like I said, I focus a lot on the youth athletes, and because they're shorter, they're really challenged in being able to do that side hop. But in general, you're just side hopping across 2 tapes, and you get all the same characteristics that we saw in all the other 3 jumps. What I like about that too is you get the evolution. So you just count the number of jumps, and I've shown that before, and I'll show it again. But that's kind of what we got here. So one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning. It's what happens, Rana, when you leave it up to me. In the chat, if you want to ask any questions, we have questions in the chat. Hello, Theodore. Great to see you again. In the chat section, and I'm going to post here that you can ask some questions. There's also a poll that was put in there. Now, if you're looking for a certificate of attendance, because depending on where you are in the world and your organization, your profession, sometimes you can get some credit for attending certain sessions, and so you can email us at there it is, education@digitsole.com. I know I ran a little bit. This is complicated for a lot of people, because there's a lot of metrics here that people aren't familiar with, that even in a lab, like I found, really 2 papers that have evaluated the concept of contact stability. I equate it to, if y'all are familiar with like Romberg's quotient, right? So Romberg's quotient is looking at the deviation and the acceleration rate of deviation or return, to that center position. So very, very similar characteristics. So I appreciate y'all asking any questions. Thank you all for coming. I know if you have to leave, but you'll know that you'll be able to view this. So let's see. If you want to, Ramsey. Hello, Ramsey. If you want to measure purely takeoff data using countermeasure of 1 jump, you need to have both insoles in. The answer is yes. And the reason for that is you will get an error, because the algorithm is designed to look for data from both of those sensors. And so I'm pushing for to get a single leg, and we're able to do that. We're going to do that soon, I hope. So, but right now, what you might be able to do, if you can sort of teach someone, I haven't really tried it yet, but if they can kind of let their foot dangle, or maybe just keep it in a toe down position, and focus on taking off on that one leg. I'm not sure if you'll get an error or not, but that's the best I can come up with in terms of trying that and seeing what kind of data that you'll get from that. Another thought too is I can't remember in the algorithm if there's part of the firewall, because in the algorithm there's a firewall because it looks for certain things. Like for example, in a walk, the reason that you can't have someone run in the walk is it's looking for double contact, double support. Likewise, in the run, it won't accept data that has double contact. So there might be something similar here. So potentially trying what I described in that. Also potentially thinking about doing the horizontal and just having them focus. I don't know if you'll get an error if there's no horizontal displacement. You might. So, but in any event, we will eventually have that single leg. So Theodore,
But I think when the analysis starts, they need to have both legs completely stable on the floor, and then when the analysis stops, they have to have them both, and then they can do what they have to do
yeah, so
during.
yes, exactly. You always have to have them both in there. But my comment about trying to perform a vertical single leg is with the counter movement, it's only registering the one leg at a time. So that way, you can kind of do with what you will on the other one, but you do have to start in a normal position. Is there a connection between vertical and horizontal jump? That's a very good question. In fact, we've got a couple studies in the work, and we're going to be measuring just that. We're going to be looking at correlation characteristics in running technique. So there's a little bit of data, and I presented this in one of my presentations, but that's why, for example, if I find lower contact time on one leg, if there's an asymmetry, and it's also characteristic of um, longer contact time with a shorter stride on that side, then I will then go to a single leg test. And I do, because it's a horizontal translation, I do the single leg hop. And what I'm looking for is the is the output, so the distance that they cover. And so that's the test. I've also used single leg vertical jump testing to evaluate that. I haven't found as much of a relationship with that. um, the whole process of measurement requires both. Yes, so it does require the insoles. You don't need the camera. I often don't use the camera. Just obviously, I know how to read the data, and sometimes I use a separate camera. In fact, I just ordered another higher speed camera that has a USB port to it, and I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to capture that with my system. I don't think I'll be able to do it simultaneously um, with the Digitsole running in the background. I don't know if the camera will run in the background, but I'm trying to find out. Like, even if you set up a high speed camera on your device and run it through the system, the frame rate isn't going to change, right? Because that's a limitation in the app itself. And
And actually, Theodore, it's not the smart insole, because the smart insoles is another product that we have discontinued. You mean the Digitsole Pro insole?
right, have you tried different shoes with the vertical jump? Maybe that's our next one, to look at the influence of shoes. Actually, uh, I'm going to be looking at the influence of orthotics. So, what would it be? I suspect it would be different. Um, well, I know for a fact it'll be different because I actually have done it. Whether it's good or bad is still questionable, depending on what's going on. So I tested a really high level young athlete, 18 years old, and we did do different shoes, and it did change his landing characteristics, but it didn't really change his takeoff characteristics, at least enough. We need to test a few more, and actually aggregate it with more people to run some statistics on that. But it definitely changes the landing characteristics, which could be really, really good for certain people if they have some problems. Theoretically, um, if there's a weakness or, lack of support in the foot, it should change some of those characteristics, at least, like I said, the ones associated with plantar flexion that's involved in that performance-based outcome measure. All right. So I think
There's
that's about it. Is there another
there's
one?
one more. There's one more. I
Oh,
suspect. Ah, sorry. You saw that. I think. One more question on the questions there.
you might, but with by the time that the heel actually comes in contact, the the foot will obviously kind of stop moving. So we won't, with our system, because we're measuring acceleration rate, you're not really going to see that. But on force platforms, we do find that that's exactly what happens, is that cushioning effect does minimize that. So we, on the downside though, if you were looking at changing direction, then having a highly cushioned heel absorbs some of that energy and actually makes it more challenging to change. So we did a few different things. We looked at low profile shoes, which are very similar to like wearing a spike, a cleat, because there's really hardly any cushioning in that. We looked at barefoot, and we looked at high cushion shoes and measuring stiffness and repeated vertical jumps, and that cushioning effect when someone comes back and lands on their heels, it minimizes that. It actually reduces their turning that back around into another vertical jump or horizontal. So no, the force is not registered the same as in the running analysis. So in the running analysis, we actually register it as in ground contact force. So that's your strike force when upon landing. So there is an algorithm for that in running. There is not when I say algorithm, it's in the biomechanics field, in the physics field, and so there is no algorithm like that for what we've been able to accomplish. So that's why it's expressed in acceleration rate. It's related to and expected to be similar to that ground contact force, but because we didn't have an algorithm, we didn't want to make that estimation, at least not just yet. So maybe we'll see, as we get more data, whether or not that actually has that complete relationship. Again, it's physics and it's gravity, so the assumption is that it is highly related in terms of acceleration at landing and peak force, right? Because acceleration is a part of that characteristic. Is there any using Digitsole Pro insoles with force plate measures to measure knee joint moments? Well, I probably wouldn't, if I'm really going to measure knee joint moments, I would probably use motion capture video analysis. Um, that will be the best, because with kinematics, you'll be able to measure that a little bit better. Now with the force plate, what you will get is you will get that peak landing force. You will also get the reduction in that. I haven't used the insoles with my force plates, although I may have a guest one of these days, because we've got a group that I'm working with that they're playing around with a test protocol that they're using their force plate and the Digitsole Pro insoles at the same time. I haven't completely abandoned the use of my force plates, but for basically what I'm looking for, the acceleration rate, like I said, I can't hang my hat and say that that's exactly what it's going to be. It's very close to that, but it's quicker, it's easier. I don't have to write any code for my Digitsole Pro, so it makes it a little bit easier. Oops, let me move. Is there something in the chat? Nope, that was from. All right. So we're a little bit past, but that's okay. The 12 people stuck around. So anyway, thank you again. Look forward to next month. So to kind of tie that in, I'm attempting a couple things. So I think it's going to be orthotics related. Rana and I will talk a little bit more about this. We know a lot of people are going to go on holiday, so even if you are, make sure you register and know that you can obviously view this as a replay.
The next one is on July 13, and then we will skip for the month of August and come back in September. So
Cool.
Theodore is typing something. Okay, hopefully Theodore.
I keep telling them to send me Theodore, so keep pushing, brother. Get me there, would you?
Thank you so much, Chris.
All right. Thank you, Rana. Take care. Everybody
Thank you,
have a
everybody.
great evening and afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Thank you all.
Bye.